Edith finds herself in a novel where she does not suspect that instead of the essence of beta, she will become an omega. The girl, knowing the ending of the novel, decides to change her fate, but everything does not go according to plan when the main characters fall in love with her, who crave her attention and are ready to do anything. One of them decides to kill his lover in order to achieve her love. Not long before this, the girl was lying on the bed and telling the man sitting next to her that she had a fever, but he ignored her and did not pay any attention to her, just looked. This man was Clyde, and he was the crown prince, so he had very good self-control. Despite the fact that the girl was in a lot of pain, she couldn't even lie down normally. He just smiled as soon as she howled in pain again. After a short silence, Clyde turned to her and said that if she was so hot, she could calmly undress, and then she would immediately feel better. This girl who suffered was called Edita, but she looked at him with a surprised look and could not believe that he really suggested such things. She began to unbutton her shirt little by little, because that way she could at least become a little colder. But she could not believe that she was behaving like this on the prince's bed. The girl's thoughts were literally confused, and Clyde said that she was forcibly holding herself back and was suffering because of it. The girl, upon hearing this, was immediately surprised and asked what he meant. Clyde then explained that her nature was beginning to emerge, so she shouldn't suppress it, but simply accept it as it was, and then I would immediately become lighter. Edita, hearing about nature, was very surprised. However, he said that everything was true. Her omega essence was gradually manifesting itself. She didn't respond to this, but only turned away from Clyde, who sat down next to her because she felt uncomfortable even looking at him. In fact, people in the world she found herself in were divided into 3 categories. The first category were alphas, some of whom surpassed others in their strength and logic. Omegas, who had extraordinary leadership qualities and sociability. And in the end, they were betas. The latter were more likely than others to cooperate, quickly assimilated into their surroundings, and were generally quite practical. This division was more important than gender, and it could become the basis for creating a family and even having a child. It also served as the foundation for maintaining class dominance and obedience. However, most importantly, alphas and omegas responded strongly to each other's pheromones regardless of their gender. However, the girl understood that she could not be an omega. She considered herself a beta. Clyde moved even closer to her, ran his hand through her hair, and said that if she sensed his pheromones, then she was definitely not a beta. After that, he sniffed the scent that remained on his hands and said that no matter what, she had the scent of omega, so she simply could not resist her fate. Edith was very surprised when she heard this. She immediately looked at the man to check his words and really saw the alpha pheromones. She reached out with her hand and suddenly placed it on his knee. She didn't have the strength to even look him in the eyes, so she simply said his name. Smiling happily, he said that she had never disappointed him, so he was very glad that everything had turned out this way. He stroked her head and asked Edita to listen to him and let the omega nature into herself. Otherwise, it would only get worse. He explained that he could help her. He wanted to stimulate her with his pheromones so that it would go faster and less painfully. Edith was still writhing in pain, but there was only one thought in her head. She didn't understand why Clyde was showing such great interest in her. She really wanted him to just leave her alone. Whether she was an omega or not, it didn't matter to her. And all because she knew perfectly well that this man was an asset in the virtual novel that she was reading. Edith looked at Clyde and realized that he was indeed the man who was obsessed with the passive protagonist. Everything was exactly like that. She got into the virtual world of the novel. Before starting this absurd life, she was a completely ordinary girl. She achieved greatness in her work and was always a leader. She had no special outstanding abilities, only a good tongue. As a bonus, she also had a bright smile, which charmed more than one man at her work and helped her close many successful deals. However, all this was until office life simply tired her out, and she went to work as if it were hard labor. Her only source of power was a specially designed adult novel that was published every week on a website. Every time the girl rode the subway to or from work, she quickly picked up her phone and read it. This novel really became a salvation for her, and she certainly found it very interesting to read it and follow how the characters developed. However, of course, She didn't say that she might like living in it, and in general, she didn't want all this. She liked her life. Yet somehow she became a 16-year-old teenager in the world of this virtual novel. She didn't know how she got to that place, let alone how to get back to her world, so she had to just accept the situation as it was. At some point, she had to accept that she was destined to stay there forever, and in that case, she decided to just stick to the golden mean. The girl who now became Edith decided that she should stand out too much from me and live an ordinary life, and then everything would go well. She was reincarnated as Edith Cates Maurice. She was from a ducal family that was distinguished by its wealth. The father squandered half of the family fortune on a useless business, and from the shock he received, he became addicted to alcohol and gambling, which is where the other half of the money went. Her mother was exhausted, both mentally and physically, and so she took Edita's younger brother and went to her parents' house because she couldn't stand it any longer. By the time she graduated from the academy, the situation had deteriorated so much that she even had to earn money herself. According to the plot, Edita inevitably had to become an employee of the Imperial Palace, and it was from that moment that problems began in the girl's life. When she turned 20, she wondered if she really was supposed to be sent as a secretary to the Crown Prince's palace. Edith yelled at the Imperial Palace's Human Resources Department and said that her first priority was the Ministry of the Interior, and she asked how this could even happen. The man didn't even know what to answer her, but he sighed heavily and said that usually people from influential families immediately became secretaries in the Imperial Palace, and she, having her family status, could not become an employee of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. He thought that there was simply a mistake in the documents, and therefore asked for forgiveness for such a misunderstanding. Of course, Edith was incredibly angry, but with a heavy sigh, she said that she understood everything, and also asked that he simply change this position to another. But the man felt even more ashamed of what he had to tell her, since the assignments had already been completed. Of course, Edith, hearing about this, was incredibly upset, and in an angry voice, she said that if he did not change this, then she was ready to request a meeting with the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The man, hearing this, was very surprised and even scared, but Edith, smiling happily, asked if he really didn't know that he had a good relationship with his father. Of course, none of this was true, but it worked, and the guy said he definitely wanted to try to get it done as quickly as possible. The girl also told him to change her assignment because she definitely didn't want to run into the Crown Prince. The frightened guy immediately began to carry out this task because he understood that jokes were definitely not necessary. And the girl, when she was convinced that he had started doing the job, simply walked out the door and breathed a sigh of relief. She still hoped that he would be able to do it. In fact, in the original, Edith was torn between the Crown Prince and the main passive of the novel. She played the role of an errand girl, delivering their letters. However, according to the plot of the novel, she was destined for only problems, so she wanted to try to live a quiet life as far away from these characters as possible. Edith was very angry because the novel was designed in such a way as to not allow the characters to separate, so she had to make a great effort not to do this. The problem was not only that she had to become an errand girl, there was another, and no less important one. There had to be constant bloody incidents around the Clyde, who had become an outstanding tyrant. Therefore, since the girl knew this development of events, she understood that it was better for her not to even approach him. She thought that it was enough for her to wait a few days, and then everything would settle down. In fact, the distributor in the HR department also asked if the girl could take on the responsibility of supplying the prince's palace until he could correct this error. Edith thought that it was not a big problem, so she needed to check the supplies in the prince's office since she had agreed to help the man. She decided to deal with all this before he arrived and quickly leave so as not to even cross paths with him anywhere. When she entered the office, she went to the desk and saw that there was ink, a stationery knife, and paper there as well. Edith wrote all this down on one piece of paper and decided that everything was in order, so she didn't need to worry. However, at that moment, she saw a small gap next to one of the doors that left the doors ajar. Coming closer, the girl looked more closely and was very surprised. She leaned even lower in order to check so that it could know, and even thought that something could simply get stuck there. But before Edith had time to understand anything, she suddenly found herself on the floor, and all because the doors suddenly opened and pushed her away. The girl even screamed a little in surprise. She hit her foot, and when she looked at the person who opened the door, everything was forgotten. And all because in front of her stood that very same crown prince, Clyde, who was an asset of which she should not have crossed paths under any circumstances. Edith did not understand why the prince was already there, because according to her calculations, she should have had a little time to spare. But when she began to look at Clyde more closely, she was surprised, because the girl would never have thought that such an appearance could exist in reality. This man was incredibly handsome, and it was really hard to take your eyes off him, so Edith knew that a lot of effort had been put into his description in the novel. He really was a handsome man. She of course imagined him handsome when she read the novel, but she didn't think that he could be so stunning. Clyde, who realized that he was the one who caused the girl to fall, knelt down on one knee and asked if she had hit herself hard. The girl did not answer this, and Clyde moved closer to her and said in a very sad voice that he did not know that there was a man under the door. The guy asked her for forgiveness and also said that he would like to look at the blow that she had received. Hearing this, Edith was very surprised, and she became interested in what he was going to look at. But then she realized that he wanted to look at her side, which she had just hit. The girl was even a little scared. She quickly moved away from the man a few meters because she didn't expect that he could say such a thing. Clyde immediately understood why she had moved away from him so much and immediately apologized for being rude. But he didn't mean it that way. The guy stood up and said that he saw her for the first time, and also added that he did not remember them ever meeting. Edith, who had already taken possession of herself, stood up and bowed, asking forgiveness for her late greeting. She said that she had been appointed as a secretary a few days ago. She gave her name and also explained that she was a lady from the ducal family. Smiling happily, the girl greeted His Highness and said that she was very glad to meet him. The man was surprised to hear this. He said that he had never heard of anyone being appointed as his subordinate, but he also said that they had not seen each other for so long that he had even forgotten her face completely. This one replied that it was indeed so. She rarely appeared in the palace, and her memories were very vague. Everything seemed unfamiliar to her. Clyde, folding his arms across his chest, suddenly asked in a rather rough voice whether this meant that she didn't remember him. She looked at him with a surprised look, and the man insisted on his own and asked if it was true. Edith then bowed again and said in a sad voice that this was indeed so, and also asked him for forgiveness, because she felt guilty. In fact, from the real character into which she moved, only simple memories from the period of her training remained. Everything that was connected with emotions completely disappeared, so the girl had to reconsider her relationship with some people. There was no Clyde in her memory at all, and there could only be two reasons for that. Either there was no need to preserve memories of him, or they disappeared because they contained special emotions that could be traumatic. But the man, hearing her answer, smiled happily and said that he was very sorry that she did not remember him, and he also added that now they should meet more often so that they could fix this. But she explained that she was appointed temporarily for only a few days, so she would soon leave him. She explained that all this happened only because of a mistake by the HR department. Very soon, she was supposed to be transferred to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The girl decided that it was best to inform immediately in order to avoid creating misunderstandings between them. But Clyde, hearing about this, was a little surprised and said that now everything was clear to him. Edith was very angry because even her careful and calm words somehow spoiled his mood. So she decided that instead of continuing this pointless conversation, it was best for her to remain silent and, bowing, she began to slowly move back. But Clyde suddenly returned to the door from which he had come out and asked the girl if she could help him, because there was one very important matter there. He looked at her with his beautiful golden eyes and asked her what she thought, if she could help him. Edith was a little surprised. She saw his expression and immediately became wary, not understanding what he wanted her to do. But she still had to go with him, because she had to temporarily fulfill his every whim. So they went into that room. Clyde sat down at his desk and smiled slightly as he said that he had to prepare for the meeting, but he had not sorted out all the papers that were lying around him. He said that there were a lot of cases, so he replied that the girl had to sort all the documents sum up the results, and prepare a report for him. Edita, hearing this, was very surprised. She stood at the entrance and could not believe that he had actually loaded so much work onto her. But the man said that she had to do it as soon as possible so as not to be delayed. Edith was even scared. She thought that he was simply making fun of her, and even assumed that her words about leaving for another department had hurt him greatly, so he decided to take it out on her. The girl had no idea how she was supposed to sort through such a mountain of documents, but she only bowed and said that she was ready to do everything possible. She decided that before she despaired and gave up, she should at least try first. Right before her eyes was the man who was destined to become a tyrant in the future, so she was aware of the fact that she had better not upset him even more if she wanted to survive. So Clyde left her alone in that closed, dark office with a mountain of documents and papers that she had to sort through. Edith was pleased at least by the fact that she could understand the content. There was nothing complicated in them, so she even assumed that she could cope with them. However, it was impossible to cope with so many of these cases in one day, and she did not understand why everything had turned out in such a terrible way. At that moment, the girl took one of the books, and as soon as she opened it, a bright yellow light immediately poured out of it. She was very surprised, but the book suddenly flew into the air, and everything around the girl changed its appearance. Edith was scared. She didn't understand at all what it was, but suddenly she saw some kind of inscription at the top. It was written there that Clyde always had his faithful assistant, Edita, by his side. She grew up in a family with difficult circumstances, but demonstrated outstanding abilities and resourcefulness while working in the palace of the Crown Prince. And immediately after Edith read this information, the color that was from the book returned back there, and it closed with a bang. The girl stood in one place and looked into the distance, not understanding what it was. 4 whole years had passed since she had fallen into this romance, but this was the first time she had seen anything like it. Edith knew it was definitely a fragment of him, an insignificant line that could easily be missed. But the girl kept wondering why she had suddenly appeared so suddenly, and even thought that it was because of that meeting with the Crown Prince. However, the man was nearby, and when she looked at him, she saw that his reaction had not changed at all. Therefore, Edith concluded that only she had seen this spectacle, which meant that she had to silently follow what was written. Of course, the girl did not understand at all how she was supposed to understand and perceive all this. No matter what she did, apparently, she would still have to become the subordinate of the Crown Prince, because that was the plot of the novel, and history would definitely not allow her to deviate from it. But Edith was furious. She thought that this simply could not be. She did not want to rush to judgment because of a few lines, so she still had hope. However, she also thought that there was a possibility that she would have to simply repeat the plot of the novel. But at the same time, Edith hoped that this could not happen, and she believed that there must be some way to avoid it. At that moment, Clyde was distracted from his business and looked at the girl and saw how she was walking from side to side, thinking about something and even a little worried. He watched the girl for a while, and when he realized what was going on, he smiled happily and said that she could stop. Edita, hearing this, immediately looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he meant at all. However, the Crown Prince came closer to her and told her to sum it up, report the main part of the processed information, and give it to him. Then he picked up the hourglass and turned it over and said that she only had 3 minutes to do this, so he would advise her to start. Edith was very surprised. She did not understand why he did it so suddenly, but she understood that for the sake of her own well-being, it would be better for her to follow his advice. Edith had only anger in her head. She thought that he was making fun of her because she didn't understand how it was possible to tell the entire content in 3 minutes. But she tried to calm herself down because she understood that in front of her was a man who in the future would become Iran. She couldn't react strangely to his orders because he would suspect something. Closing her eyes, she decided that she needed to concentrate, and she began to remember the information she had read. Edith went through a lot of documents in her head, and finally, when she finished, she turned to the man and immediately began to say what she remembered. The girl said that at that time, the cost of maintaining standing armies was too high. Therefore, there was an opinion that costs should be reduced as well. She said that only one person, Count Katinas, tried to strengthen the imperial power. He proposed to begin an audit of property and introduce taxes for the aristocracy in order to increase the budget. However, hearing this, Clyde suddenly told her to stop, because that was enough for him. But Edith, as soon as she heard this, was very surprised, because the time he gave had not yet passed, and she immediately became upset, because she understood that he most likely did not like it. However, she was also aware of the fact that if his answer was not satisfactory, he could become very angry with her and even kick her out. But to her great surprise, Clyde simply turned around, threw his jacket over his shoulders, and left without saying a single word. Edith was of course amazed, but she thought it was even better this way. The man meanwhile rang a small bell, and then the butler came into his office, bowed and asked His Highness if he had summoned him. Clyde replied that Miss Kate's Maurice had passed the test, so he thought she would be of great use to them. The butler, hearing this, immediately applauded. He was very glad that finally there was a worker who would meet the requirements of His Highness. He congratulated the man for finally finding his outstanding talent. However, Clyde then suddenly said that it turned out that she had originally planned to work outside of his palace, and he asked the butler if he could solve this problem. Clyde explained that he definitely could not let go of such a talented person, because she could help him solve many problems. Edith, who was standing not far from them, and did not hear the conversation, but saw that they were pointing in her direction, immediately wondered what they were saying. Seeing the butler, she even assumed that this was some kind of test to check for lice. But the butler at that moment said quite loudly that they were immediately ready to take the necessary measures, and Edith understood what they were talking about. She panicked and did not want to be left there at all. She immediately turned to His Highness and wanted to say something, but Clyde suddenly came quite close to her. He looked her straight in the eye without taking his eyes off her, and said that from that day on, she had to help him with his work in the special room and his office. Edith was very scared, because she understood that she simply had no choice. She had to agree to it. So, sighing heavily, she left the room and thought about how she could have come to this at all. All this time, the girl tried to escape, and ended up getting stuck even deeper among people quite close to His Highness. He mentioned a special room. Eddie thought it might be some separate room. But when he brought her to this special room, she was genuinely surprised. The girl could not even imagine that this special room could turn out to be the prince's bedroom. She even had the feeling that she had become his personal secretary and had to fulfill some rather intimate requests. She was also alarmed by the very location of the room, since the crown prince's bed was quite close to Adita's workspace. They were separated by only a very thin wall, and there was no personal space. But the girl understood that she could not despair. She had read only 25 free chapters of this novel, and the later plot was unknown to her. But she was sure that Clyde had to become a tyrant, and was worried because she did not know the reasons for his changes since she had not read up to that point. When the girl approached the portrait and looked at his rather stern gaze, she realized that he really could be a good tyrant in his field. Edith wanted a quiet life without meeting him, but she couldn't do it, and she just had to accept the situation as it was. But there was also one more detail that remained unchanged, and it consisted in the fact that the only person who could stop the birth of the tyrant Clyden was Adrien, the most powerful Omega in that world. However, it was still a long way off until their meeting, so the girl was confused and didn't know what to do. She even considered that perhaps it would be best for her to just work quietly in the office until then, and then worry about the consequences. Or she had to somehow try to speed up their meeting in order to resolve this issue. When this thought came to Edith's mind, she was glad because it meant that she didn't have to wait. She didn't think that something terrible would happen if she couldn't cope with any consequences. She would fight. When the girl was sitting at her desk, suddenly her tension dropped and she began to feel sleepy. Several hours had passed since then, and she was indeed sleeping peacefully, even though she was sitting at her desk. Cloud, who had solved several issues and came into the room, saw the sleeping girl and simply watched for a while. He wondered if Edith had really been pretending not to know him. However, the man also understood that if this was not so, then he could not believe that she could forget about him. This upset him very much. He touched her hair and thought about how much she had never imagined. He thought about how much he could meet her again someday. And what did he feel when he saw how beautiful she had become over time? As soon as Cloud began to remember their meeting, a smile immediately appeared on his face. He straightened her hair because it was getting into her eyes, and looked tenderly at the girl because he really liked her. At that moment, Cloud suddenly felt a rather strong attraction, especially when he ran his fingers along her neck. It became much harder for him to restrain himself. The man convinced himself that he couldn't do that. He had to restrain himself, and he couldn't stand doing that. But at that moment, Edith's hand suddenly trembled a little, and her sleep became more sensitive. The man, seeing this, immediately became wary and wondered whether it was a coincidence. But suddenly, he saw how a weak energy began to appear around her. Cloud was very surprised that she could react to the alpha's pheromones, because he considered her different. Some time passed from that moment, and Edith began to wake up. As soon as she opened her eyes, she saw that someone was standing next to her. The girl turned her head to the side to see who it was, and then she saw Cloud in front of her. She was very surprised and did not understand what the crown prince was doing next to her when she was sleeping. She felt very ashamed, and she lay back down, pretending to continue sleeping. She tried to calm herself with the thought that he could have just arrived and not been watching all this time while she was sleeping. So, straightening her back, the girl thought that she needed to calm down and act more confidently at such moments. Therefore, Edith threw her head back, adjusting her hair and looking at His Highness in surprise. She asked if he had already arrived. She also said that she had been thinking about this because she wanted to discuss something with him. Cloud was very surprised to hear this and said that it seemed to him that she had been sleeping all this time. Edith laughed nervously and immediately said that it was not so at all. It just seemed that way to him. But the man continued to insist on his own and said that he did not think so. After that, he took a small sock out of his pocket and began to wipe her face. Edith was immediately surprised. She did not understand what he was doing, but she suddenly realized that she was drooling in her sleep, and he saw it and began to wipe it away, so she felt very ashamed. So her ears even turned a little red. But Edith understood that even if that was the case, she still expected that she would be scolded at this job, so she was ready for anything. However, this time he was so soft, and she didn't understand why Clyde was so completely different from what she knew. In fact, Clyde, whom she knew, had an axe only for the main passive Adrien and was strict with his subordinates. That's why he was used to driving everyone almost to death with his character. But now he suddenly treated the girl so politely and even tenderly. She understood that something was wrong there. But when the man finished wiping, Edith said this and immediately thanked him. And after that, she began to think of how to explain this whole situation to him. She decided to tell him straight and replied that she decided to take a little rest while there was no work. The day was just dragging on very slowly, and she was a little tired. Cloud suddenly laughed very loudly and asked if she was really bored. They talked for a while longer, and then suddenly a lot of servants came into their room, carrying things. Then the butler bowed and turned to His Highness and said that they had carried all the man's things, said that they had done a good job, and also that they could go already. Everyone immediately bowed and said goodbye and left the room, leaving the girl alone with the crown prince again. Edith immediately looked at him with alarm and asked if it was really what she thought. Smiling, Cloud said that he thought she was having a hard time fighting off her sleepiness, so he asked her to move the work to a place that would ease her burden. Adjusting his hair, he smiled happily and asked where else she could find such a wonderful boss as him. Edith looked at him in surprise, completely unable to understand what he was saying, and with such a terrible expression on his face, he looked like a real idiot. Then she pointed towards the bookcase and asked what he would have ordered her to do with such a large number of documents. Shrugging his shoulders, Cloud told her that she would of course have to consider all of this first, and when she asked if she really had to do this, he still asked if it was really too much. Edita replied that of course it was too much, but the man then snapped his fingers and said that he understood everything. And pointing to the work table, he said that it would be very uncomfortable for her to work on this hard table, so he suggested that it was also necessary to put a bed so that she could rest. Edith was about to object, but the man replied that he thought he could have come up to her in principle, and the girl was irritated and didn't understand whether he was going to listen to her at all. Of course, she didn't want to give herself entirely to work in the new world, so everything around her became more and more dangerous. If she hadn't done anything about it, she would have just blindly followed the plot for the past 2 years, and all she wanted was a steady paycheck and nothing more. Then Edith realized that she had no choice, so she turned on her acting and, with tears in her eyes, turned to His Highness and said that she actually had a bad back. She also said that she tried to get a scholarship because of family problems and spent too much time in the library. Cloud, hearing this, thought about it and said that in that case there was nothing to be done. They had to improve the working environment so that things would go easier. Edith heard about this and immediately beamed with joy and asked if this was true. The man replied that of course they had to spend a lot of time together, and for this reason he could not allow her to despair so quickly. After that, he began to lead her out of the room and said that business was finished for that day, so it was time for her to leave. Edith wanted to object, but he said that he knew what she was thinking, but she just had to trust him and go with him. He explained that there was one more thing that had to be done, so he called her his first reliable assistant and told her to move forward quickly. Of course, as soon as Edith heard that she was now a reliable assistant, she was very surprised. He began to push her out of the room again, and the girl thought that if everything continued like this, then she would definitely suffer from the amount of work, as it was in the original novel. She believed that she needed to bring Adrien as soon as possible so that everything would calm down and return to normal. And so, several days passed from that moment, and Raymond Edit finally came to the county. The girl was a little worried because Raymond County had a lower status than her family, but they made more money in manufacturing. This was the place where the main passive of the novel, Adrien, lived, and the girl came there specifically to change the course of events. She was also very glad that he responded positively to her letter, because she thought that he could have refused. But fortunately for her, she was not there. Immediately after work, as soon as Edith came home, she wrote down the address, but it was a request to visit him under the pretext that they were classmates. At the academy, she tried to avoid him in order not to interfere with the plot, but Adrien readily accepted her visit to her surprise. However, there was also one problem. As soon as she opened the reply letter from the man, the same strange thing happened again, just like with the book. A bright light appeared around her, and then she saw words at the top. It was written that in the world where the Alphys and Omegas lived, there were 2 ways to have a child. The first way was to use their nature and aminos, and Beta is able to get pregnant if they received 7 alphas. The second was to use gender. A woman could get pregnant from a man even if both were born Omegas. She didn't understand why I needed this information at all, because she already knew it all perfectly well, but she still considered it rather strange. This passage appeared on Adrien's letter, but it certainly couldn't stop her, so the girl entered the estate. When Edith went inside, she saw a rather beautiful interior. In fact, this man was the only beloved of the crown prince. He had the same outstanding appearance as Clyde. He was a man with a friendly character, to whom everyone was drawn because he was a really good friend. And this man was just a good key that could free the girl, so she was serious. When Adrien walked by, he was sitting with his musical instrument and playing it, but he heard the girl's footsteps and immediately stopped playing. The man stood up from his seat and quickly walked closer to her. For a while, they just looked at each other. Adrien smiled happily and turned to Edith and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and he was very glad to meet her again. The girl was a little worried, but she immediately made a curtsy and said that it had really been a long time ago. She greeted him in an official key. Edith also asked if he had chewed well all this time, but as soon as the man saw all this, he immediately laughed very loudly. He said that it was too much and she was addressing him as a stranger, and he didn't like that. Adrien looked at her and said that he hadn't heard anyone call him by his last name for many years, and also replied that they were just friends, but she could have just called him Arte. This one was very surprised because it was a nickname that only the closest people addressed him with, so she even felt a little awkward. But in fact, this was a fairly common sight at the academy. Adrien was constantly surrounded by people who were afraid of losing his attention, reacted especially sharply, being quite jealous and right at that moment, as soon as Adrien broke through his game and communicated with the girl and did not stare at them. Edith, seeing their intent gazes, immediately said that she did not know that they had a meeting, otherwise she would have come another day so as not to disturb. But Adrien smiled and replied that she could ignore it because he was just about to finish the meeting, so she didn't have to worry. He asked her to wait for him for a while, and very soon he had to return. The man needed to settle a few more issues. Edith was very happy because these alphas had no more chances since he already had a second half, which had been determined in advance. A short amount of time had indeed passed since then, and they were left alone and sat down at the tea table to talk. Adrien smiled while drinking tea and said that he was really surprised at first when he saw the letter from her. It even seemed to him that this was the first time they had met like this and had a calm conversation. Edith, not one of them, laughed and replied that it was really very unexpected. But what worried her most was that the conversation began with this very discussion. She didn't think that it could be like that. Adrien then smiled and said that it wasn't just unexpected. He had thought all this time that she hated him. As soon as the girl heard about this, she was sincerely surprised and asked what he was talking about, how she could hate him. The smile faded from the man's face rather quickly, and he said that he didn't know if she remembered, but he tried very hard. At that moment, Edith realized that this was the first time that they had gone through the history of the Lagran Empire's changes. He gathered all his courage and finally sat down next to the girl and tried to start a conversation. But Edith then suddenly stood up from her seat and, asking for forgiveness, said very loudly that she urgently needed to go to the restroom. In the end, when she returned, she sat very far ahead. He tried to repeat this also on holidays. He made similar attempts in the library, but for some reason, she always avoided him. So with a heavy sigh, Adrien said that was why it was hard for him to try to talk to her. She always avoided him, and there was nothing he could do about it. As soon as Edith heard this, she understood perfectly well that his actions were not accidental. He was specifically trying to communicate with her, and at that moment, she realized that she did not remember some things at all. The girl sighed heavily and said that it was most likely just a coincidence, but she was really ready to apologize for hurting his feelings. She of course didn't know if he was interested in her, but whatever the reason, something else was more important to her now. This one turned to him and said that she didn't think he knew her, so she was afraid to get involved because he might not even remember her name. She decided to organize a meeting of the main characters, so she decided to smoothly move on to this topic. But Adrien was very surprised as soon as she said these words and asked how he could not know the pride of the entire academy, and this was not an exaggeration at all. But Edith began to resist and said that no matter who you asked, he was always the pride of the academy. She explained that there were always a lot of students hanging around him who wanted to just look at his face. The man suddenly lowered his head and asked Edith to finish, because it really embarrassed him. Her appearance always faded with time, but her intellect, well, it was and will be dazzling. Edith immediately laughed and told him not to be modest, and not to downplay his talents either. They were both good. They sat in silence for a while. Then Adrien looked at her, and the girl apologized for calling him by his full name, and explained that she could not get used to calling him by his nickname. The man again felt a little awkward and uncomfortable. He was worried, but still dared, and said that in order for her to get used to calling him that, they should see each other more often in the future. He also smiled and asked her to tell him why she suddenly wanted to meet him after so many years, because there was definitely some reason. Then the girl was glad that the conversation had finally reached this topic, so after some silence, she spoke anyway. This explained that if she told him that she simply remembered him, it would be very strange. And Adrien, hearing about this, was sincerely surprised. But the girl understood that all this sounded absurd, and in his place, she would have thought exactly that way. But the man suddenly protested and said that it was not at all strange. He also thought about her all the time. As soon as Edith heard this, her eyes widened greatly. She could not believe that it actually worked, because she did not even have the slightest hope that it could work. However, Adrien suddenly jumped to his feet and shouted loudly, saying that there was no need for reasons. It was better not to even look for them. He really wanted the girl to come at any time, and to be able to do so even without a warning letter. Edith was amazed at his determination, but said that it would be too rude and she did not want it to be like that. However, Adrien replied that he could make it so that she could come to him at any time. Of course, she thought it was too much. She knew perfectly well that he was polite to everyone, but they also needed to observe at least some standards. Well, the man was ready to rush to the servants in order to warn them about this, but he didn't even have time to move away when Edith grabbed his hand. She shouted his name loudly and thanked him, saying that she worked in the palace of the crown prince and it would be difficult for her to come often, so he could not notify the servants. She also straightened her hair, looked him straight in the eyes, and asked if it would be so difficult for him to meet her at the palace, since she would hardly be able to find time to visit him all the time. Adrien immediately thought about it. His cheeks turned a little red, and he asked if she was sure about this decision. When the girl waved at him in agreement, he said that it would really be even better that way and he would definitely come. Hearing this, she immediately became happy and realized that she had managed to convince him, and this was simply wonderful. She didn't work in the palace for very long, so of course it would be difficult to reveal all the details. In fact, there was no free time in the ears of the workers there, so she wanted to ask for time off for personal reasons at the main gate. She was His Highness's trusted servant, so she could say that she invited Adrien to the palace several times. Edith seriously believed that she should not have received a serious reprimand, but the most important thing was that they were destined to be together, so the girl wanted with all her might to bring them together. Smiling, she thought that if she could arrange their meeting, then sparks would fly from them, and then they would definitely be grateful to her for the rest of their lives. When they stayed with Adrien for some time, she decided that very soon these two would have to create a relationship that, according to the plot, could only appear after several years. When they finished their conversation, Edith suggested meeting at the palace in a few days, and the man did not mind. Then she sat back down at her place and said that the tea was already getting cold, and that cold tea was not as tasty as hot tea, so she suggested that he sit back down. Adrien looked at his mug for a while after that at the girl and was silent the whole time. But then the man turned to Edita, and looking straight into her eyes, he said that this time he would like to sit next to her and asked if he could do it. But she did not object, and smiling said that he could sit down at any time and did not even have to ask about it because they were now good friends. Adrien immediately smiled and thanked her, and also apologized for being pushy for a while. Now he was going to do everything right. Then the man actually sat down next to her, and while they were drinking tea, the girl felt how he was looking at her intently. Edith turned towards him and asked if she really had something on her face, since that intense gaze was making her feel uncomfortable. Well, Adrien continued to smile and said that she had nothing, but she asked in that case why he kept looking at her. The man then replied that he was simply delighted and didn't think the day would ever come when they would both sit next to each other and just talk like best friends. Adid turned away from him and laughed nervously, replying that he never ceased to amaze her. Even though she allowed him to sit down, he was still too close, and most importantly, the passive one was too handsome, so of course she felt very uncomfortable. At that moment, as she thought, she didn't even feel how Adrien moved closer to her, and they were already a few centimeters apart. The man turned to her in a very gentle voice and asked what she was thinking about. Edith was amazed at how close he was, and so she didn't answer, and the man only said that things were getting more interesting. After that, he reached for her hair and said that he should have always been more persistent. He thought that she hated him, so he decided to let her go. Edith did not understand what this strange atmosphere was between them, and wondered whether this kindness that was described in the novel was Adrien's politeness or even interest. She also wondered if she could find a man who would not succumb to such temptation. She could also try to get closer to him if she did not know the original story. However, since she knew him very well, she moved away from him and said that from that day on they could definitely be friends, so he no longer had to be afraid. Edith understood perfectly well what was actually happening because she remembered the plot very well, so she responded in exactly this way. Of course, the man was a little surprised by this, but he asked in a frustrated voice if she still didn't understand anything. Adrien asked how she could not understand the reason why he wanted to get closer to her. Of course he liked this status of friends. Edith, hearing about this, was very surprised. She got worried again and asked the guy what it meant, although she understood it perfectly well. The contractor, who had been standing over her the whole time, turned around and stepped aside and said that they were adults and that of course it was not about friendship at all. At that moment, Edith remembered the passage from the novel that appeared in the letter, and it happened because such a strange situation could happen between them. She knew that Adrien was an Omega and therefore could date an Alpha. But there was also the option of going the man's way and dating a girl. Edith sighed heavily and found the strength to turn to Arte and ask if it was true that he was an Omega. And she smiled and asked if it wouldn't have been easier for him with an Alpha. Why did he have to choose her? The man never turned to her. These words hurt him incredibly, but he kept it to himself and said that he was still a man despite the fact that he was an Omega. But then Adrien realized that he had rushed things too much, so he asked her for forgiveness. But he still turned to her and said that he looked at her like a man looks at a woman. Edith was very shocked by this, and he told her to at least remember this fact and take it into account. When several hours had passed since that moment, the girl had already returned home. It was deep night outside, but she was still lying in her bed and could not fall asleep. All the time she wondered why everything had taken such a strange turn of events. Edith just wanted to improve the relationship between them. But in the end, events went completely in the wrong direction. This was not a delusion at all. Adrien definitely had a love interest in her, and she wondered how long ago this had been happening since she had not noticed it before. The girl was horrified. She didn't understand where her life was heading because she wanted something completely different. Clyde and Adrien were certainly very beautiful, and even just looking at them was incredibly pleasant to the soul. However, if she took the original into account, then she understood that she had to improve their relationship with each other, and in no case involve herself in it. Of course, they were very attractive if she looked from afar, but she could not stop loving any of them because these men were made for each other. This one understood very well that the wife of the crown prince had to attend many events. It was a strict life according to the rules of the imperial palace. The girl certainly didn't want this, and if she had become Adrien's wife, the jealousy from the alphas and women would definitely never end. There would be some kind of rallies all the time, and she would even be persecuted. Every day of hers had to be filled with fear, and she certainly didn't want that. She had only one desire that she wanted to fulfill. This one wanted to work less, earn more, and live a quiet life. She wanted exactly that, and not this confusion with men. When the next day came, Edith was already sitting on her horse. Of course, she was surprised that her day off had ended, and she had to go not to her desk, but to the shooting range. The girl was driving through the forest and was very pleased with this turn of events. In fact, when she came to the room, Clyde was not there. The butler met her with other clothes that she had to wear. Edith was surprised, but she thought she had a chance to laze around. But she was told to change and leave because she was already expected elsewhere. And besides, these clothes were too luxurious for a simple servant like her, so Edith felt doubly uncomfortable. She didn't understand what Clyde was even thinking when he ordered her to do this, but after some time, she finally got to the right place. When I saw a man there, who was also dressed in a special uniform, and he looked quite attractive in it. In his hands, Clyde held a weapon and had already taken aim to shoot, and somewhere in the meantime, she stopped her horse and got off it. In fact, she didn't understand all this. She never liked all this shooting because she simply didn't see the point in it, and as soon as she heard the sound of the shot, she immediately remembered in her head a moment from the novel about the bloody purge that lasted 7 days and nights. When Edith saw him, she realized that Clyde no longer looked like himself. Only the crazy emperor remained. And he disappeared forever as a great warrior and shooter in that room. There was only a madman who was ready to do anything. He held the pistol in his hands and without hesitation pointed it at Edith. And then he took it and fired without any hesitation in his hand. Edith came to her senses after this memory and was very surprised that such a memory came to her at that very moment. The girl did not fully understand what it was, and also assumed that it was most likely a time of repression. Then Edith remembered that according to the plot, Adrien was able to stop him, but she did not understand why such memories surfaced in her memory on that particular day. After this, the girl heard many birds fly away from the trees and fly away somewhere. Because of the loud sound, they all got scared and decided to find a safer place for themselves. For a while, Edith simply looked at them and even suggested that perhaps this memory was her warning. And it warned that those days were already approaching, and she needed to be ready. At the moment when Edith was heading to the man, She had already begun to wonder whether this was really the novel she remembered, and whether the events should be the same. For example, the changes that happened in Adrien really surprised her character. He was never interested in women, and then he was ready to just pounce on her. That was just his character, and the genre of the novel was that there was a same-sex relationship. But the problem was that he expressed signs of sympathy specifically for her. Of course, she wasn't going to just accept Adrien's feelings. Such an emotional line never existed in the novel, so there was a high probability that this was just his spontaneous decision. And when she thought about it, she realized that true feelings could not give up so quickly. Events had changed a little, but returning to the original was still possible. That's why Edic didn't lose hope, because the only one who should have been connected with Adrien was Clyde, the man who stood in uniform and shot right in front of her. As soon as the girl came closer to him, the man immediately saw her. He took his watch in his hands, looked at the time, and said in a rude voice that she was late. She explained that she arrived at work on time and that she was late because the order was only received in the office. The man then shut his feelings and said that there was nothing wrong with it. The most important thing was her clothes. Edith immediately looked at her appearance and asked what was wrong with her clothes. She explained that she was given this outfit, and she put it on, thinking that this is how everything should be done. Clyde thoughtfully said that of course he had chosen it, but he was now a little unsure of it. The girl herself, as soon as she heard that she was wearing the outfit that Clyde personally chose, was very surprised. In fact, the clothing of the members of the imperial family was of great importance, as it was a reflection of the owner's dignity. Therefore, it was necessary to always monitor one's appearance. But even if so, Edith still did not believe that he had chosen this outfit for her on his own. For a while, Clyde just looked at her. After that, he came closer to the girl and began to cover her with his jacket, saying that things definitely could not go like this. He asked her to put it on top. She immediately looked at him in surprise, not understanding why all this was necessary. And Clyde, moving closer to her, explained that her riding outfit looked too good on her. Edith, hearing this, even felt a little embarrassed. She stood there and couldn't believe that he had really just given her this compliment. But what worried her most was the fact that he had put his jacket on her, and now she could not take it off because the crown prince himself had put it on. The man meanwhile approached his assistant and, taking the weapon from him, turned to Edith, asking if she knew how to handle a weapon. The girl replied that she was not quite ready for this yet, but the man said that it was very easy. Then he showed how to charge it. After that, Clyde demonstrated clearly that it was necessary to aim and pull the trigger. He handed the gun to the girl, asking if she was ready to try. Of course, Edith didn't have the best memories of guns. She had recently seen herself being shot at, but she didn't want to miss the chance to get a new experience. So, smiling happily, she said that she would really like to shoot once, since he had said that it was not so difficult. Clyde then moved closer to her and laughed and said that this is exactly what he thought. The girl, hearing this phrase, was even more surprised and asked what he meant. However, the guy did not explain and simply told her to forget it, after which he extended his hand forward and asked her to follow him, because he was ready to teach her how to shoot correctly. Immediately after that, they went in the other direction. Edith took the gun in her hands. Her body was shaking because for the first time in her life, she held a weapon in her hands. She pointed the gun at the targets and asked if she should have aimed like this or in some other way. But the man said that her posture was too unstable and would be thrown back by the recoil of the shot, so she needed to change it in order to stay upright. Edith sighed heavily and said that it turned out to be more difficult than she thought. She tried to change the favor, but the man did not like her again, so he decided to take the initiative into his own hands. Clyde came closer to her and began to adjust her arms and shoulders as they should be, and also said that it was not as difficult as she thought. He took her wrist and told her to hold the handle tightly so that the barrel wouldn't wander. He grabbed her by the waist, pulling her closer to him, and said that she had to keep her center of gravity under control so that the recoil wouldn't really carry her away. Edith felt very uncomfortable, so she couldn't concentrate. He was too close to her. Her cheeks turned a little red. She decided to focus on how to shoot correctly, and Clyde suddenly asked if she wanted to shoot with him if she couldn't do it herself. But the girl replied that this was not at all the case. She could have done it herself. The principle was clear to her, so she asked him to move away, because she already wanted to try. Clyde was a little surprised when she heard this, but he still gave her space and allowed her to do it on her own. Then Edith began to take aim. She did this for quite a long time, so the men's patience began to run out. Raising his voice, he told Edith to just pull the trigger, and when she did, the recoil was really too great. The weapon flew in the opposite direction from her, and the girl began to fall. But fortunately, Clyde managed to run up to her pretty quickly and grabbed the girl by the waist. He looked her straight in the eyes and, smiling, asked if everything was okay with her. He knew perfectly well that this was how it was supposed to happen. Edith replied that she was fine, and then asked how she managed to shoot and whether she had hit the target. The man smiled and said that it was really very good, and continuing to hold her by the waist, he asked if she could already stand on her feet. The girl immediately said that of course she could, and also asked why he was taking her in the first place. She just lost her bearings a little when a very loud sound occurred. Then he put her on her feet, and moving even closer, he asked if she had accidentally smelled a rather strange aroma, and I asked her if she might have had a feeling as if something had changed in her. Hearing this, Edith was of course surprised and asked what he meant. The man simply said exactly what he said. Clyde smiled and also asked if maybe she wanted him to hug her longer so he could easily arrange it. As soon as Edith heard this, she immediately screamed loudly, threw the man aside, and said that this was simply outrageous. The people who were standing nearby also saw this whole scene and were very surprised. They could not believe that the girl treated His Highness like that. But the girl herself understood that she had crossed the line and immediately asked him for forgiveness. She knelt down and, lowering her head, said that she had committed a mortal sin. The man meanwhile turned to his assistants and, waving his hand, said that they didn't have to come. He himself could sort it out. After that, Clyde leaned over to her and told her that there was nothing to worry about. She didn't have to be afraid. He allowed her to treat him more freely, so everything was okay. Edith was very surprised when she heard about this, because she did not know when he could allow her to do this. But as soon as she raised her head up and saw that he was winking at her, she immediately realized that he said these words specifically in order not to aggravate the situation. Then she understood that she had to play along, so she happily smiled and replied that she had not felt what he was talking about, and also added that he had some pretty strange jokes. She also said that at that moment she felt a little dizzy, which is why she felt so strange. Clyde, upon hearing about this, immediately became interested and asked her to tell him more about it. The man immediately became very serious, as if he believed her in it. Edith, of course, knew that she couldn't tell him that she had started to feel strange when he adjusted her stance, so she replied that she had simply lost consciousness for a second because of the loud noise. She asked him for forgiveness for possibly scaring him, but Clyde, upon hearing this, said that he understood everything, and also that she did not need to apologize. After this, he began to leave, and said that with this, he suggested ending the lesson, and without saying another word, he left Edith standing there alone. The girl was shocked by his behavior, but on the way home, she decided not to think about it and soon completely forgot about this situation. And her life eventually began to change gradually. She was always by the crown prince's side because her duties included that. Edith managed Clyde's entire schedule, so she was constantly by his side. The wardrobe in the special room contained a lot of different clothes, which allowed her to be ready for absolutely any situation that a man could come up with. New secretaries also appeared, who shared the work with the girl, so it became a little easier for her. One of her main tasks was to listen to various stories that were related to Clyde. Of course, her life didn't become any easier, because the real work began only after this time. The girl didn't get any sleep at all, carrying out the man's orders. And when in the evening, having completed them, she returned to the office, she saw a multitude of documents that were awaiting her review. Of course, she was very upset about this and did not know if she would ever be able to read and understand all this, but she had no choice but to forget about her fatigue and get to work. Edith sat down at her workplace and decided to think about what she should start with. Due to lack of sleep, the girl already had quite severe bruises and bags under her eyes. Edith sighed heavily and did not start. She began to think about how she could quickly figure this out, because she really did not want to do all this. She also suggested that she could ask the servant who was connected with this task to sort out some documents. Then she would unload herself at least a little. But then she suddenly heard Clyde's voice, who came into the office and said that she had to do everything herself. The girl was very surprised, and, raising her head up, immediately asked His Highness why he had suddenly come, because she thought that he was still busy with business. But Clyde smiled happily and said that he had gotten out early, and just in time to catch her using tricks that were forbidden. There was an awkward pause between them, because Edith understood that she really was to blame. He had entrusted this work to her, and she was already thinking about how she could transfer it to someone else. The girl smiled happily and said that of course it was her job, and therefore she had to do everything herself. Clyde was satisfied with this answer, and he said that of course it was so. That was exactly what he expected from her.